She was a shadow pressed into the edge of the road, the heat wavering off the asphalt like a mirage that refused to end. Trucks thundered past, their wake lifting dust and the faint rattle of candy wrappers caught in thorn bushes. Her coat, what was left of it, lay in clumps like burned grass on a field after harvest. Every breath shuddered through her ribs as if lungs and air were strangers arguing at the threshold. A fly traced the torn edge of her ear. She kept her eyes on the middle distance where the road bent toward a pale, rinsed horizon, as if the bend might undo time and send back the person who left her. The sun tilted. The shadow of a lone neem tree crawled closer, and with it a sliver of mercy. She tried to lift her head when a motorbike braked and sputtered, when footsteps paused, when voices softened with pity, then rose with fear, then retreated. Hunger made the air smell metallic. Pain braided itself into the simple act of existing. When the light turned the road copper and ghosts began to gather, a small white hatchback slowed, indicator ticking like a heartbeat. The car door opened. A man stepped out and crouched. The world narrowed to the calm of his breath and the trembling of her own. For the first time in days, something in her loosened, so small it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. Hope, splinter thin and barely alive, but hope all the same. The first chapter is called The Edge of the Road, and it begins with the world as a thin line between her and everything that kept moving. The dust, the light, the song of an exhausted afternoon, the indifferent procession of tires. A woman sells guavas at a wooden cart under the neem and witnesses the daily ritual, the dog trying to stand when footsteps approach, then sinking back with a sound that is not a whine, but the absence of one. In this chapter, the story belongs to the dog's stubborn body and the heat that makes thought swim. There is a memory she clings to, a hand that once smelled of kitchen herbs and gasoline, a drive that ended with the door closing and the road stretching like a question no one ever answered. The chapter gathers witnesses: the fruit seller, who talks to her in a low voice as she packs up, a boy who leaves a crust of bread, the driver of a cement truck who swears he saw her blink and swerved wide as if steering around his own shame. The camera stays close to the ground, at eye level with ants climbing the pitted tar, until evening leaks into the sky and the roadside becomes a ledger of small mercies and larger abandonments. The second chapter is called The Stopping, and it belongs to the man in the white hatchback, who will later be accused by his sister of bringing home every stray pain he finds. He is on his way back from a warehouse where pallet jacks squeal and paper cuts bloom along his fingers like thin red petals. He is tired, the kind of tired that makes music on the radio feel like gravel in the ears. And yet the sight of the animal pressed against the earth arrests him so completely that he forgets to signal before pulling over. We watch the choice as a slow, careful thing, the keys turned off, the ticking of cooling metal, the door opening, his knees lowering to meet her fear where it lives. His hands become visible instruments of intention. He speaks in Urdu so soft it defeats the wind. He slides his palm along the ground rather than toward her face, so she can sniff the dust of him first. The guava seller steps forward with a cloth and a prayer. Night loosens its belt. He phones a friend in rescue. The chapter suspends itself between leaving and helping, between the instinct to preserve one's life from complication and the deeper instinct that ties us to the breath of another living thing. The third chapter is called The Lift, and it happens all at once and also in small, reverent increments. A muzzle looped from a strip of cotton, a towel folded into a cradle. The dog tries to strike but finds only air and the surprising absence of anger in the man's eyes. She gives up like a door gently closing. When her body rises, it reveals the nest she had made in the weeds. A bottle cap, a slick of cardboard, a shoulder print and dust. The car becomes a temporary ambulance. The guava seller crosses herself in the language of her mother before offering a handful of notes to help with whatever injections she will need. The hatchback's cabin fills with the smells of iron and road, dog and hot upholstery, fear and the citrus tang of the man's soap. The dog's head rests against the door as if listening to the map of the city unfolding in beeps and horns. The chapter ends at a clinic door where a bell tinkles and the light turns clinical, brighter than hope, bright enough to show everything broken and everything that still works. The fourth chapter is called Under Fluorescence, where mercy meets method. The vet is a woman who has learned how not to cry until she is alone with the sink. She moves with the logic of triage and the tenderness of someone who has memorized the weight of pain, temperature too low, hydration poor, a paw pad torn as if she walked on shards of silence. Worms, ticks, fleas. The familiar choir of neglect. The dog fights the needle until she doesn't. The man signs a blank space on a paper, the kind of commitment that can swallow a week's wages. In the waiting room, time slows. A boy with a broken kite watches through the window. The vet shaves a patch of matted fur and whispers, "You made it, John. You made it to the part where you rest." When the dog sleeps, the man texts back a flood of messages he has ignored all afternoon. His sister's picture of the lentils bubbling for dinner. His foreman's reminder, the bill for electricity. He deletes the draft of a message to the number he hasn't dialed in 5 months, the one that used to belong to someone who left. The chapter ends with the vet placing a blanket over the dog, as if crowning her with ordinary warmth. The 5th chapter is called First Names, and it is where they give her one. Names are small boats pushed into dark water. They try a few in low voices, each too bright, too heavy, too borrowed. The guava seller visits and offers an azar, because she survived the evil eye. The boy with the kite prefers a rocket, because what else can you call something that outlived the sky? The man chooses a Safa because the word feels clean, like a room after sweeping, like the first breath after a fever breaks. Safa opens one eye and closes it again. The vet smiles and writes it neatly on her chart, as if entering her into the world by paperwork. The chapter moves through the first sips of water, the first careful stretch, the first tail twitch that is not quite a wag but already a promise of one. The world shrinks to a stainless steel bowl and a blanket warmed in a dryer. And in that small world, something vast begins to steer them all. The 6th chapter is called The House with the Blue Gate, and the man takes Safa there because the clinic's beds are needed for emergencies, and besides, he cannot bear the way she searches for him when he steps toward the door. His sister has known this would happen since they were children, and he brought home a wet, shivering pigeon and slept on the floor so it could have his bed. She pretends to scold but puts a pot on the stove and lays out an old sheet, then another, then a clean pillowcase stolen from the back of a closet. The gate swings and the yard smells of damp concrete and fried onions, of ordinary life and its miracles. Safa hesitates at the threshold, as if afraid the house will vanish if she commits to entering it. The man kneels and pats the ground, not commanding, inviting. A wind moves through the hibiscus leaves and the sound of a tuk-tuk rattles somewhere on the other side of the neighborhood. A neighbor peeks from her roof and sets down a bowl of rice. The chapter ends with the smallest thunder, the weight of Safa's body choosing yes as her paws cross into shelter. The 7th chapter is called The Slow Return, and it lays out the work that is never shown in montages. Pills hidden in cheese, baths that turn the water gray. Nights where nightmares make her legs run without her. The man learns which sounds are kind and which are warnings. He discovers that touch can be too much, and that kindness must sometimes look like distance, like letting her watch from the doorway while he washes dishes, talking the whole time, describing the shapes the clouds are making as if they were ingredients in a long, patient recipe for trust. The sister places her dupatta on the chair Safa prefers so it smells like a person who loves. The guava seller visits with the boy, who has found thread to repair his kite. They all speak to her in the present tense, a circle of voices that gather around the fact of her aliveness. The chapter measures progress in soft domestic ways. A meal finished, a corner inspected, a sigh that sounds like surrender to sleep rather than a plea to wake up. The 8th chapter is called Bones of Weather, and it is the one where the monsoon breaks. Not with drama, but with a steady, generous rain that smells of stone relaxing. Water threads down the alleyways. The blue gate grows darker, grateful. Safa stands in the doorway and tastes the air. Thunder does not seem to scare her. Perhaps she has already outrun the loudest storms. In this chapter, time spills in 2 directions. The man remembers a childhood spent building paper boats with a father who was stern but kind. A father who taught him that love requires both shelter and the courage to let things go free once shelter has done its work. Safa remembers something too, though we can only guess. A roadside, with no rain, a waiting that brews the days into one endless noon. The rain draws them forward into a season where wounds knit and appetite returns. The sister laughs at the way Safa sneezes rain like it is a joke between them. The chapter closes with the first real wag of a tail, small but definite, like a road bending toward home. The 9th chapter is called The Return to the Road, and it is not the one you fear. The man brings her back in daylight, when traffic is slower and the fruit cart sets up in the shade. He wants Safa to see the road as a place that can be passed through rather than a god to be worshipped in terror. He packs water and gauze and a halter that says her name in tiny stitched letters. The guava seller greets them like cousins. The boy with the kite has traded his broken one for a paper plane, and he sends it skittering over the heat. Safa sniffs the place where her body once lay and sits, then lies down, not in surrender, not in despair, but as if setting a stone back where it belongs. The man sits with her. They watch the world move without being swallowed by it. A family on a motorcycle, a man hauling rebar, a woman with bangles like bells. When they get up to go, Safa looks over her shoulder and then doesn't. A circle has closed without anyone forcing it. The 10th chapter is called The Door Left Open, and it is the quietest one, which is always how true endings come. The blue gate stays ajar in the evenings now, because love has turned into habit. Safa meets visitors with cautious interest rather than alarm. She dreams less, or perhaps dreams better. The man's sister makes a second cup of tea without needing to be asked. The vet sends a picture of a puppy who needs a temporary bed, and everyone knows what will happen next. The story doesn't end with fireworks, but with the ordinary radiance of a dog sleeping with her chin on a shoe, her breath steady. The house held in a kind of blessed truce with all that is outside. The last image is a morning when the sky is the color of mercy and Safa steps across the threshold into the yard, pauses, and looks back, not from fear, but in acknowledgement. She is seen. She is staying. The door is there. The world is there. And the world at last is kind enough to be shared. She lay the first night at the blue gate as if afraid it might change its mind, the iron cool against her nose, the scent of rust clean as rain. In the kitchen, the sister stirred lentils, the spoon scraping the pot like a boat paddle against the shallow edge of a lake. He knelt on the tile and unfastened the improvised halter with hands that spoke a language softer than words. Safa watched the arc of his movement the way one watches an approaching wave, braced for the hit, unsure if it will drown or lift. When the loop slipped free, his palms hovered. The room seemed to lean toward them. He did not reach for her head. He placed his hand on the floor beside her paw, then left it there as if offering her the possibility of a bridge. She sniffed his skin, the city on him, the tin echo of the warehouse, the faint sweetness of guava from the vendor's cart. A fly landed on the window. He did not swat it. Patience spread out like a cloth. He whispered apologies to the parts of her that had been asked to be brave too long. He asked permission, 1,000 small permissions, to share the air, to bring the water bowl closer, to sit cross-legged and talk about nothing much. There is a way of speaking to a dog that is really speaking to the wound and the life underneath it. He told her about the road he had taken as a boy to school, the one lined with jacaranda trees whose blossoms were the exact purple of a bruise healing. He told her about his father's toolbox and the way the wrench felt solid in his palm, how the right tool made even the stubbornest bolts give. He told her about the number he kept in his phone under a name he couldn't delete, though he never dialed it. How kindness had once arrived and then left without waiting. He did not tell her that seeing her tucked into the gutter had felt like seeing his own heart at the side of the road, because some sentences are too heavy for first nights. Safa did not answer in words, but her breath sharpened and then softened in the way of animals deciding whether a thing is danger or shelter. She took water, 2 tonguefuls and then another 2, as if apprenticing herself to the act of receiving. He placed the bowl, stepped back. She licked the seam of the tile and closed her eyes. Around them, the house made its own old music. A tap that always needed tightening, the fat clock in the living room thudding every hour like a patient drum, the neighbor's radio playing a song about a woman waiting at a window. He folded a sheet into a cushion and added a pillowcase on top. She ignored it and put her head on the bare floor. He smiled. He knew about preferring the thing you chose to the thing that was chosen for you. He whispered again, a kind of chanting that had no religion except the promise not to leave. When she startled a third time and let out a sound that fell somewhere between a bark and a sob, he lay down an arm's length away, cheek to the tile, and matched his breathing to hers. The sister found them that way when she came to set a cup of tea beside him, 2 creatures practicing the difficult art of staying. Morning lifted itself from the corners. pale and curious. The rain of the night had rinsed the alley. The hibiscus flowers held bowls of water like small, humble miracles. Safa raised her head with the stiffness of a much older body, then licked the inside of her leg where the vet had shaved a patch. The man sat up. He felt every year he had ever lived settle back into him, and then rearrange themselves to make room. He stretched and his back cracked, and they both looked embarrassed, then laughed, the kind of laugh that doesn't need sound. He told her name in the light, not as a test but as a morning's first true sentence. Safa. She didn't wag, she blinked like someone registering a gentle knock. Routine arrived and set the table. Tablets crushed into egg. A gentle bath where the water first ran black, then gray, then pink as if washing a bad dream from a child's face. She endured with a stillness that was not trust but something adjacent to it. He worked his fingers through the ruined fur and found a rumor of softness at the nape, a tender place where her puppy self hid like a secret. The sister brought towels warmed in the dryer and pressed them against the chill that sometimes rose from inside her like fog off a river. They spoke about practical things. The vet's schedule, money, the absurdity of arguing with fate. It is difficult to be sentimental when there is laundry to hang and rice to rinse, and the power may go out again in the afternoon. In that difficulty resides a grace. Love becomes a task among tasks, a sacrament administered between the peeling of garlic and the paying of bills. When the guava seller arrived at the gate with a brown paper bag, Safa lifted her head and made a sound that sounded like the memory of a bark. The boy with the once broken kite stood behind her with the solemn pride of a messenger. The seller told the story the way it needed telling, with pauses that let the air feel what had happened. The days, the heat, the ways people stepped around pain as if it might stain their shoes. The man who did not. The sister listened and nodded at the parts that required nodding and pursed her mouth at the parts that required worry. She bent to Safa and made the formal introduction people in the neighborhood used for visiting aunties and brides. "This is your house now, too," she said, as if the house required reminding. That night, storms stitched themselves along the horizon, lightning silently opening and closing like a camera shutter in the distance. He watched Safa watch the weather. Fear made her body narrow, then widen, then narrow again. He moved to sit in the doorway so she could choose whether to be inside or outside, and still be with him. The alley held the smell of wet dust, that holy scent that lifts from the earth like gratitude. A man on a bicycle passed holding an umbrella awkwardly like a flag. Somewhere a transistor radio sang the old songs that people play when the new ones feel too sharp. The sister called from the kitchen that the bread would get cold. He called back that the bread could forgive them once. They ate on the floor beside Safa, their plates held carefully because she flinched at the clink. He told the story of a dog he had once seen on television, rescued from a storm drain and taught to trust by a woman whose hands looked like his mother's. He did not say that even then he had wondered if love could be learned late, and whether he was the kind of student who would show up to class. The vet's text became a thread through their days. Increased food is tolerated. Check gums. Watch the wound on the hind leg for heat. He learned to touch without startling, to approach not from above but from the side, to let her nose dictate the distance. The sister learned that praise given too eagerly could be frightening. That silence sometimes worked better than a cheer. The guava seller learned the precise squeeze Safa liked behind her shoulder. The boy learned to send his paper plane into the alley only when Safa was watching, and to catch it before it landed with a clap that wasn't too loud. The neighborhood learned the names of new medicines. The hibiscus learned to bloom with rain caught in its throats. Everything learned. On the fifth morning, Safa walked into the living room as if following a map only she could see. The rug felt strange under her feet, the pattern a small ocean. She smelled the couch and the shelf and the glass that held the dead roses. The sister couldn't yet throw away. She found the place at the base of the window where the sun pooled warm as milk. She lay there and, without meaning to, slept. The man stood in the doorway and watched the sun move along the floor across her paws, up to her ribs. He had not been a father, or a husband, or much of anything people can name with a title that fits easily on a form. Watching her breathe, he felt a new category open up in him, something tender and unspectacular, like the word neighbor, or caretaker, or simply witness. He brought her back to the road because some ghosts must be addressed where they were born. He chose a day without wind to keep the dust from needling her eyes. He packed water and gauze and a hope he did not confess. The blue gate clicked behind them with a sound that felt like the punctuation of a prayer. The alley opened into the main road. The world poured out of itself again. Vendors, students, the relentless shrug of mechanics as they coaxed miracles from old engines. Safa took small steps, her paws remembering and forgetting in the same instant. At the corner she paused, nose to air, the past closing its fist and then opening it. He waited. He wasn't teaching her bravery. He was offering her the dignity of choice. At the place where she had once laid herself thin to escape pain by becoming part of the ground, she sat. He sat with her, forearms on his knees, the shape of two beings refusing to be hurried. Cars swerved wide. The guava seller folded a newspaper beneath herself and sat too, turning the corner into a small congregation. The boy threw his plane. It looped and fell, and he retrieved it and tried again. The chapter of their lives that would later be told at dinner tables began quietly here, a shared refusal of the old choreography. No one saved anyone that day. They simply stood up together and left, and the leaving itself, gentle and unremarked upon, was a kind of victory that did not need applause. Days became the kind of days that do not require naming. Safa learned to accept the leash, not as a chain, but as a conversation. He learned to read the slight tilt of her head that meant she could not bear loud laughter that day, or scooters or strangers with bags. She learned the shape of his return from work, the hum of the hatchback, the little cough it made when grudgingly starting, the shuffle of his shoes in the hall. He learned the angle of the sun that made her shift places, how she liked her water not too cold, which pills could be hidden in mashed banana, and which must be folded into buttered bread. The sister learned that grief could be used like yeast to raise the bread of the ordinary, that loving their small house, as if it were a thing that could be lost, made everything inside it glow with inexpensive beauty. The guava seller learned that she was part of a family she had not known she was missing. The boy learned the precise number of steps from his building to the blue gate. The vet learned that sending a picture of a puppy would unstitch the man's resolve within 3 minutes. The puppy arrived like a storm and a sunrise at once. Safa was not delighted. Her lip lifted. He did not correct. He set the puppy down with the humility of a person offering flowers to an old teacher. The puppy wobbled toward the water, drank, sneezed, scared itself, tumbled backward, and slept with its chin on the threshold where hot air met cool. Safa watched from her place by the window, eyes not hostile, but tired in the way of queens observing a clown. He sat between them on the floor and talked about nothing important, the price of onions, the color the sky gets when there's dust in the air, how sometimes you remember the weight of a hand more than the hand itself. The house adjusted. Patterns nuzzled their way into days. Morning walks, flea checks, the late evening silence when the neighborhood softened. On a day with a sky like washed cotton, he left the gate open and sat on the step with a cup of tea. It was a kind of experiment, though he would not have called it that if anyone asked. Safa stepped to the line the threshold drew, tested it with her nose, then stepped back and lay down with her shoulder against the frame. Freedom is not only the ability to go, sometimes it is the safety of wanting to stay. The tea cooled in his hands. He drank it anyway. The sister watered the hibiscus. The guava seller left a small bag of fresh fruit with a note in looping schoolgirl handwriting that said only, "For Safa, and whoever she loves." The boy sent his paper plane into the alley once, twice. Then on the third throw landed it perfectly at Safa's feet. She lifted a paw and rested it on the paper as if to claim flight without needing to fly. On the last evening of the season, before the rains took their leave of the city, the sky broke open in a gold so deep it felt edible. He took Safa and the puppy to the roof where people go to breathe when the rooms are too full of argument or joy. The neighborhood assembled in its gentle disarray, children counting the bats, aunties comparing the quality of the year's mangoes, old men arguing about a cricket match whose outcome had been decided hours ago. Safa stood with the wind in her coat and something like the memory of a forest rising in her nose from the leaves of a neighbor's potted basil. He touched her shoulder, then let his hand fall. He had learned finally that some gestures are for the person who makes them, not the one who receives them. The puppy chased his own tail and laughed without sound. The sister took a picture she would never show anyone because it felt too much like a secret blessing. The three of them against a sky low enough to touch. The city around them old and kind and ugly and beloved. The kind of evening a person remembers when everything else blurs. Later, in the blue gate square of shadow, he folded the blanket at Safa's place and watched her turn a circle and settle, the heavy exhale of a creature who has negotiated a truce with the dark. He thought of the road and the first sight of her, a bundle of wrongness the world had overlooked. He thought of the repair of small things, the way a steady hand can sometimes coax life back into a wire, a sentence, a heart. He did not compose a speech for this. He set his palm on the ground beside her paw, as he had on the first night, and waited for nothing. Safa lifted her head and placed it just once upon his wrist, light as a vote. Then she slept. When morning came, it came the way truth usually does, with the gentle insistence of light entering a room that has no curtains. He brewed tea. The sister hummed a tune their mother used to sing when polishing metal until it reflected a small, perfect band of sun. The puppy tried to chew a slipper and failed. Safa walked to the door and sat, not asking, not refusing. He opened it. The world smelled like itself, diesel and spice, and the green sour life of drains and the soap of someone's laundry. She stood there a moment, remembering the geometry of open space, then stepped forward, swayed, corrected, found her pace. He stayed a half step behind, the easiest choreography he had ever learned. A man on a motorbike nodded. The guava seller raised a hand. The boy with the paper plane saluted with it, and it flashed white in the sun like a bird. There wasn't an ending so much as a deepening, a low tide that revealed the sand that had been holding them all along. But if you insist on a closing image, let it be this. A door left open to a courtyard washed clean, a pair of sandals set neatly to one side, a dog whose name began as a hope and became a fact, lying with her body poured soft as flour into the shape of the morning. While somewhere far away the road goes on unwatched, ordinary, just a road, and the person who never came continues not to come. And somehow that is no longer the point. The point is breath. The point is the way light collects in the bowl of the hibiscus after rain. The point is a wrist warmed by a resting head. The point is staying and saying with the way you live, I am here. I am here. I am here. The first cold wind of the season came through the blue gate like a messenger, sliding under the door and lifting the corners of the kitchen newspaper. It found Safa on the rug by the window and made her blink as if a thought had stepped into the room. Outside, the street had changed costumes. Fewer mango peels, more fallen leaves, boys with their collars up, women tucking shawls around shoulders as if the air had remembered how to bite. The puppy, who by now had stopped being a rumor and become a noisy fact, had grown into an exuberant tangle of legs and optimism. He followed Safa with unembarrassed devotion, overshooting corners, skidding on tile, learning and forgetting and learning again the respectful distance that elders prefer. If he had a name, it had arrived unceremoniously one afternoon when the guava seller laughed and said he bounded like thunder. Igurgu, she called him, clumsy, round, inevitable. The name stuck like a smudge of mud you decide is charming. Safa met Gurgu's adoration with a measured tolerance that deepened slowly into a fondness she took care not to show in public. When he slept with his chin on her back leg, she pretended not to notice. When he got his paw tangled in the curtain, she would glance once at the man as if to say, "You see, this is the future," then get up and free him with a soft huff of resignation. In the quieter hours, early morning when the alley sounded like someone turning over in their sleep, or late evening when the metal shutters coughed closed, she taught him the map of safety, which sound from the street meant stand behind me, which hand signal meant wait, which corner of the house was his when guests arrived, who moved too quickly or laughed too loud. Her patience had the density of something forged. Man watched and recognized a lesson meant for him too. Love that doesn't perform only repeats itself until repetition becomes shelter. At work, the warehouse filled with winter light that made every dust mote look purposeful. He counted cartons and corrected invoices and found himself daydreaming, not the soft kind that floats, but the deliberate kind, where a future is rehearsed until it feels possible. There were practicalities. A sturdier latch on the blue gate, a thicker blanket for Safa's place by the window, a plan to set aside a sliver of each paycheck for vet visits instead of pretending emergencies were storms that only came to other people's houses. He started walking home by a different route to pass the pharmacy where the woman with the neat handwriting would order the good glucosamine. On his phone, the folder named a house, filled with notes about non-slip rugs and the right kind of bowls for dogs whose throats tighten when they lean too far into hunger. The folder named a family stayed empty and did not hurt as much as it used to. Safa's body, stitched by hardship into a tighter silhouette than nature intended, began to loosen around the edges as if her ribs had been convinced to stand down. She kept the habit of sleeping with her nose pointed toward the door, but the angle softened, lost its sharpness. The sister swore that Safa's eyes changed color with the time of day. In the afternoon, they held more green. In the evening, more amber. When the sister needed dough, Safa would press her shoulder against the woman's shin, and the woman would lean lightly back, an exchange of weight that felt almost like speech. Everything in the house had developed new uses. The hallway was a training ground for courage. The bathroom, a chapel where fear could be named and let go of in increments under warm water. The rooftop, a theater for evening rituals, a shared orange, a shared silence, the hanged pleasure of noticing the first star. The cold that arrived was not cruel, but it came with teeth, and the city's dogs felt it like a memory. The sister, who had once measured love by the number of tasks completed in a day, began to measure it by the number of moments she noticed. Safa's sigh when the sun found her spine, the way the man's mouth softened when he said her name, the unremarkable joy of water boiling. When the city's brief winter reached its most beautiful afternoon, the kind where the sky is an enamel bowl turned upside down and the breeze smells like the insides of clean drawers, they took a longer walk. The man had come to understand that walking with Safa was less about distance than about permission to halt, to study the cloud of smells around a broken brick, to stare at a gate as if the secrets of iron were more interesting than whatever lay on the other side. They turned left where they usually turned right, and the new street startled all of them with its unfamiliar chorus. Different vendors, different quarrels, a different geometry of shade and sun. In front of a shuttered electronics shop, a cardboard box sat slightly askew as if it had changed its mind about being in this world. He did not intend to look. He did not intend anything except a gentle walk and the settled pleasure of returning home. But Safa stopped, and then made a sound so small it could have been a cough, or a word she had once known and suddenly remembered. He followed her gaze. In the box, as if placed there by someone who believed in mercy but not in follow, through, lay a black and white shape in the particular wrongness of shapes that should be warm and were not. The first thought arrived as a blame. Why would someone do this? And then left without argument because blame could not warm the tiny body in the box. He bent. The shape trembled, but not like cold or fear. It trembled like a wire that had carried too much current for too long, and was now humming from leftover energy. Eyes sealed with crust, chest making the fast rhythm of a thing still negotiating with breath. He looked at Safa. Her posture had changed, a precise realignment he felt in his own ribs. Not today, he said aloud to whatever gods handled the distribution of burdens. Please, not today. He was tired in his bones. Money was a conversation he avoided even in his own head. He had promised his sister they would keep this season simple, no new obligations, only the daily beauty of maintaining what they had. The world, uninterested in his promises, breathed on. Safa moved closer and placed her nose inside the box with the delicacy of a surgeon reaching past blood to find a pulse. Gurgu, who had been busy cataloging every smell a new street offers, fell silent and sat, his haunches touching the man's ankle, as if trying to ground both of them. The man slid his hands under the small body and lifted. The weight was shocking. He could have put it in his pocket. He tucked the pup under his jacket. Not because it made medical sense, but because every instinct he owned insisted that warmth was a language more persuasive than logic. He walked back fast, then faster, then at the end he ran. The kind of run that isn't about speed, but about bargaining with distance. The blue gate opened, and the sister's mouth did the thing it does when she is about to scold, and then forgives herself for it. She cleared the table, found cloth, boiled water, texted the vet with the shorthand of mothers. Found pup box, cold, slow breath, eyes stuck, what do? The vet replied like a metronome, warmth first, sugar, do not feed, rub, wait. Safa stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, guardian and witness. She did not crowd. She did not pace. She watched the man's hands learn a new weight, smaller, more demanding, less forgiving of error. The pup's breath rattled and then missed a beat and then returned with an indignant squeak that made everyone in the room laugh, which felt indecent and holy at once. The sister murmured something that sounded like the song she sang when their mother had fevered. The lyrics were not about illness, but about boats finding the right shore in fog. Gurgu, fascinated and appalled by the small creature's insistence, hid behind the curtain and peered out only when the pup squeaked again, as if overseen by a scandalized ant. Night pooled against the windows. The stove clicked and turned the kitchen its familiar gold. He held the pup under his jacket for an hour, while the sister warmed towels in shifts and Safa kept her post at the doorway. An old captain on a new ship. The pup's breath steadied into a pattern that felt like a person practicing a prayer until the words became themselves. When at last the vet arrived, hair damp from a day that had not gone as planned, she stepped into the small hurricane of love and work and made it briefly still. She did the things that turned panic into procedure, checked heart, checked gut, checked the place behind the ear where despair leaves its thumbprint. Early, she said, as if naming not just the pup's age, but the hour at which a life can be turned, but willing. They all exhaled and discovered they had been holding the day in their chests for longer than was advisable. No one agreed to keep the pup. No one named it. No one made a speech. Reality sat in the corner making its sensible noises. Rent, rice, time. The sister ladled lentils into bowls and pretended her wrist didn't shake. He looked at Safa as if she were the senior partner whose vote would decide the firm's fate. She stretched, slow and final, and crossed the kitchen to the pup's nest by the stove. She lowered her head until her nose nearly touched the pup's belly, breathed in, and then out. When she lifted her head, the room felt decided. The sister pretended to complain. The man took the complaint in his palms like a delicate plate and set it gently on the shelf reserved for good jokes. Gurgu, seizing the chance to be brave, came forward and put his chin on the edge of the towel and sighed in a way that made the vet laugh out loud for the first time all day. The night that followed was a series of vigils, traded without ceremony. He dozed in a chair and woke to the sister's hand on his shoulder, her eyes saying, "Go, lie down, I have this part." Safa slept sideways against the cabinet, her body arranged so that if the pup cried, she could be there in 2 steps and a breath. The house learned the new tempo. Stoves hum, pup's small keening, the polite cough of the clock announcing a late hour. At 4, when the city's stray cats hold their parliament on rooftops and the world smells like iron and milk, the pup made a sound like a complaint and peed on the towel. The sister cheered softly as if the team had scored. Morning walked back into the house in pale shoes. The guava seller arrived with a jar of ghee and left without staying, as if she knew the house had turned into a chapel, and that chapels work best with fewer witnesses. The boy sent a paper plane under the gate with a note scotch taped to it. "I have named it Pale Roshni, first light, only if you want." The tape lost its stickiness, and the note fell off, and Safa, without stepping on it, moved her paw until it slid against the man's foot. They didn't call the pup First Light. They called him Roshni, because houses give names room to grow. He lived. He lived in the small, stubborn way that makes a person pay attention to breathing as a mutual project. He lived through the hour when sleep is so heavy it forgets to include the lungs. He lived past the first bath, which revealed the improbable truth that under the mottled grime his fur was the color of old paper. He lived into the time when he could grip the edge of the towel with a conviction that surprised his own mouth. Each survival was not a victory march, but a quiet check mark on a list no one had written down. Safa followed him through the house at a distance that oscillated with the weather in her chest. When he squeaked too loudly, she flattened her ears in the theatrical manner of elders, who understand that comedy softens fear. When he slept, she slept a foot away, as if guarding required enough space to prevent anyone from thinking their presence was conditional. When he woke in the blue hour between night and day and whimpered because the world was both too large and too eager, she stood, shook once as if arranging her bones into the right order, and went to him, lowering herself onto the tile with the grace of something practiced. Roshni pressed his small skull against the place on her foreleg where fur had grown back with a different texture after the shaving at the clinic. She let him, and the room's temperature rose by a degree no instrument could have measured. The man watched the geometry of their bodies and understood a thing about repair that no sermon had captured for him before. That rescue is less an event than a way of organizing time. It is grocery lists and bowls warmed a little in winter. It is walking the long way home because the short way has a gate where a dog once barked meanly and left a scratch on the sole. It is learning the scent of your loved one's fear and how to dilute it with your breath. It is returning to the place where you broke and sitting there long enough to see that the ground does not remember you as a wound. On a night stitched with cold stars, he carried Roshni to the roof and sat with his back against the water tank, Safa pressed to his shin. Gurgu sprawled like a spilled alphabet. The city was a low roar and a high hush. He thought of the road and the box and the door left open. He thought of the number in his phone he no longer needed as a talisman of who he had been. He did not feel larger or better or redeemed. He felt ordinary in a way that made his skin fit. He held the pup with one hand and reached his other to the air, spreading his fingers like someone testing if the weather is good for drying clothes. The air held him gently and without fuss. Safa lifted her head and rested it in the cradle of his palm for a second that lasted long enough to anchor the rest of his life. Downstairs, the sister set the next day's dough to rise and glanced at the window where their mother had once polished the glass until the morning could see itself. It was late. The blue gate stood ajar the way a sentence sometimes keeps itself open for one more thought. The road ran where it always had, unoffended by being ignored. In the corner by the stove, the towel, warmed, folded, its edges aligned like people facing the same direction, waited. And for the first time in a very long time, the house felt not simply safe, but generous, as if it had discovered it could make space for whatever came to the threshold, without losing itself. The heat lifted early that year, and left behind a strange, restless wind, the kind that rattled tin signs and worried laundry into knots. By afternoon, the sky had a pale bruise blooming along the horizon. By evening, power lines were humming, and the alley cats moved with their heads low, as if listening for something beneath the earth. Safa stood at the blue gate and tasted the air. She had learned to measure weather with that long, patient body. How rain sits in a cloud like a held breath, how dust announces itself with a dry sweetness that coats the tongue. Gurgu trotted back and forth with the frantic joy of a messenger who has not yet learned that not every message is good news. Roshni, still light enough to be scooped with one hand, slept beside the stove with his legs splayed, the perfect indecency of a baby who trusts a room to keep his heart beating while he is busy dreaming. The man checked the latch, checked the buckets, checked the small emergency kit the vet had helped him assemble, and that he secretly hoped he would never use. In the warehouse, they had called him soft when he left early to take Safa to the clinic, but softness had become a discipline, a spine, a way of moving through the world with both eyes open. He set a towel by the door in case a neighbor's dog panicked in the storm and needed to be dried before it could be comforted. Sister filled thermoses with tea and slid them into sweaters so they would keep warm longer. They were not superstitious people, not in the dramatic way, but they had built a house of small rituals against the chaos of weather and grief. The storm did not arrive all at once. It took the long way, as if circling the city, taking inventory. A snap of cool across the ankles. A hush as birds dropped out of the sky into trees and turned their voices down. Somewhere far off, the test note of thunder, a throat clearing before the area. When rain finally came, it was fat and argumentative, smacking the pavement in sentences. The alley became a narrow river. The blue gate darkened to the color of damp slate. In the kitchen, the sister lit a candle even though the power had not gone yet, because light that belongs to you is different from light that can be taken away. The man lowered the windows, leaving them a crack so the house could remember how the world smelled. Safa paced once, twice, then stood still, a compass needle arguing with north. The man opened his palm and let it hover near her shoulder. She leaned almost imperceptibly. It was the lean that undid him. The way a creature who had spent so long braced against abandonments now allowed her weight to be shared. He told her the weather was only theater, that thunder was clouds clapping their wet hands, a joke their mother had told when they were small enough to be fooled by the pleasure in her voice. He meant it for himself as much as for Safa. Then came the noise. Not thunder, not rain. Something else threaded through both. The shriek of brakes followed by the hollow, tinny clang of metal kissing concrete. The alley magnified it. The sound bounced and multiplied until it felt like the room itself was shaking its head. Safa's ears went up, went back, went up again. The man lifted his eyes toward the gate. The sister said his name with the particular weight that means be careful. Another sound, a dog not crying exactly, but making the bewildered plea of an animal who has discovered a new kind of hurt and cannot place it in its internal map. He moved before the thought finished forming. The towel by the door, the shoes he kept unlaced for speed, the small headlamp he had bought after the last storm when they had searched for a neighbor's kitten under the stairs of 8 buildings. The sister tried to follow and then stopped herself, because one of them had to keep the house steady. "A call if you need hands," she said, and the sentence sounded like a vow. The alley was a gloss of lamplight and water, the puddles each holding a shaky piece of the sky. In heavy rain the world narrows. You see only the circle your body inhabits and a little beyond it, as if the universe is teaching you how to concentrate. He walked into that circle, careful of the slick places, voice already softened into the register that pulls frightened creatures toward it. "How?" he called. "Idar, easy." Gergo pressed to his knee, thrilled by purpose, chastened by the weather. Safa stayed behind him, not out of fear but out of a new, learned wisdom. Sometimes leadership is the space you leave for others to move into. Near the corner, a motorbike had skidded into a stack of crates outside the electronics shop. The rider stood with both hands in his hair, unhurt, repeating a single sentence like a stuck song. "I didn't see it. I didn't see it." The crates had spilled their neat private insides into the rain, wires unraveled like intestines, a sad comedy of gadgets drowning in an element they had not been built to meet. And beneath the lowest crate, cowering in the scant shelter the wreckage offered, a medium-sized dog, brown-mottled with black ribs counting themselves out loud, stared at the chaos with eyes so wide the white showed all the way around, the way eyes do when the world has briefly lost its edges. The man crouched. The angle made the rain a curtain over his face, but gave him the vantage creature's trust. Smaller, slower, safer. He spoke the nonsense language of comfort, the one that carries meaning without requiring reason. Beneath the crate, the dog pressed flatter, trying to become two-dimensional, to slip between water and stone. Safa stood behind the man and emitted a sound he had heard only twice before, a low, steady hum that vibrated more than it traveled. A note that said, "This is a map I know. Follow me." It was not addressed to him. It was addressed to fear. A neighbor arrived with a plastic sheet and, without asking, held it above them, turning rain from aggression into background. The rider, reduced by gratitude to a quiet, held the bike steady so it would not topple further. Slowly, slowly, the man lifted the crate off the cowering body, not in one movement but in increments, pausing after each inch as if asking permission. When the crate was gone, the dog's body didn't change shape. He had become his fear so completely that even freedom felt like a trap. Then the lightning came down close enough that the sound and flash competed for the same slice of time. Gergo jumped, found the man's calf with his shoulder, anchored there. Safa did not move. She lowered her head until her nose was a breath from the cowering dog's paw, and she exhaled. Once, again. The man watched the almost invisible shift. The trapped dog's shoulders rose by the width of a finger, then fell, then rose again and did not fall quite as far. The world had not stopped throwing noise at, but a small private frequency had been established, a narrow band where comfort transmitted. He slid the towel under the dog, not to drag him but to turn the cruel cold of the pavement into something his skin could consent to. "A bass," he murmured, the single most useful word in their language. "Enough." The dog lifted his head by a degree that allowed his nose to catch other information. Rain, metal, the rubbery smell of the man's shoes, and, more importantly, the scent of Safa's coat, which did not smell like fear. He spoke until speaking changed nothing, and then he spoke a little more, because words perform their own magic in storms, building a scaffolding of sound that the shivering can lean against. The ride home was a procession of compromises. The rider righted his bike, faced it toward the wind and pushed. The neighbor held the plastic above them like an awning. The man carried the dog on the towel like a stretcher. Gergo trotted ahead, and then remembered himself, and trotted beside. Safa brought up the rear with the patience of a shepherd moving a flock of thoughts toward shelter. The blue gate opened as if it had been waiting to release them from the test. Inside, the sister had arranged bowls and cloths, turned the stove low, created a geography of warmth. Under the kitchen light, the new dog trembled as if connected to a motor. He was older than Roshni had been, younger than Safa, scarred in the random places that suggest a life negotiated at high speed. His paws splayed when he tried to stand as if the ground were a trick. He took water, but not food. He flinched at the scrape of a chair. He did not flinch at the kettle's whistle. Some sounds enter the body as neutral truths. The sister spoke to him as she would to a guest who had arrived damp and ashamed. "Sit, let me. You are not trouble. We will make space." The vet's name, when the man dialed it, felt like the emergency contact carved into the back of his ribs. She answered on the second ring, voice steady against the storm. "You have that tone again," she said, and somehow managed to smile through the line. She walked him through what he already knew: warmth, sugar water, check the gums, keep the room's noises predictable, and then said something new. "If he doesn't try to run, you can borrow courage from your other dog. Let her show him what the floor is for." He turned to find Safa already demonstrating, lying on her side with her spine long, one leg out, her breathing slower than the storm's. Roshni, roused by the hum of important voices, toddled over, sniffed the new dog's ear with scandalized fascination, and sneezed. The sneeze startled everyone into laughter they had been holding too long. Owls do strange things during storms. They stretch and then snap back. They swallow minutes and spit out seconds. The man learned the tempo again. Rub, speak, wait. Rub, be quiet, wait. The new dog, whose name arrived later like a shy guest, they would call him Rahi Traveler, let his head sink to the tile in a gesture that could have meant surrender or could have meant trust. When he closed his eyes, the room did not darken, which was something. The sister, a practical woman who believed in tea and timing, wrapped another blanket around him as if swaddling a future. Then, because rescue stories tell their own jokes, another noise. A shout from the alley. A voice frayed by panic calling a dog's name the way a person calls into a well. The man met the sister's eyes. She shook her head no and meant yes, go. "I will hold this line." Safa stood but did not move. Leadership again looked like staying. He grabbed the umbrella, the headlamp, the second towel. Gugu bumped his knee twice as if to say, "Take me," then accepted the doorway when told. The blue gate banged once behind him and then remembered to be quiet. In the alley, the storm had softened to a luxurious rain, the violence shaken out of it. A boy, maybe 12, stood barefoot in a puddle that had dreams of being a lake, yelling for Tara as if syllables could become a leash. The man recognized the particular wreckage of a child who has lost a small god. "Where?" he asked, and the boy pointed toward the low wall that bordered the open drain. The man's stomach clenched. The drain could host snakes and worse stories. He walked toward it feeling older than he had felt the hour before. The headlamp cut a clean white path over the water's wobbling surface. He called not Tara, because he did not know that name and names matter, but the vowel music of invitation that any dog understands. From beneath the overhang, a small, quaking face appeared, eyes luminous with reflected light, body shaking the way reeds shake when the wind does not care what shape they are meant to hold. She was a city dog, slight and smart. Her paws mud-glazed up to the joint like someone had dipped her for fun and then forgotten to laugh. The boy said her name again, and she tried to move and couldn't, stuck not by obstacle but by the physics of fear. The man lay flat, shoulder blades registering the cold of stone, stomach remembering old spills, and reached. He did not grab. He let his fingers be a bridge. She placed one paw, then another, then made the little leap that is courage's whole biography. He slid her into the towel, lifted, stood, returned her to the geography, where boys and dogs belong together. The boy sobbed with relief and hid it in the dog's neck. The dog, affronted by this display of feelings, licked an ear and shook herself free of the last of the drained story. Back inside the blue gate, they made room the way gases do, expanding without complaint to fill the shape of their container. Rahi slept. Tara stood on the threshold like a princess who has rehearsed all her entrances. Safa watched this new arrangement with the equanimity of a tree granting shade to whoever stands under it. The man, soaked to the stripe of his ribs, stood very still in the kitchen and understood something he had been approaching without naming. He was not rescuing dogs as a way to fix himself or earn a softness he feared he didn't deserve. He was simply a person who, when the road bent and presented a small beating heart, knew how to carry it through the bend. The storm passed. The city shook itself like a wet animal and grinned, unashamed of the mess. In the quiet that followed, they ate hot bread with ghee because some foods rethread you into your body after weather has tried to unpick you. Safa slept with her chin on Rahi's towel, a border guard allowing safe passage. Roshni dreamed his legs into absurd motions, racing toward a horizon he would reach and then reach again. Gurgu lay publicly exhausted, sighing in the theatrical way of those who want credit for their patience. The sister hummed as she rinsed the cups. The man leaned his head against the cold of the kitchen wall and allowed himself the small, clean luxury of tears that arrived without shame and left without apology. Sometime near dawn he woke on the floor beside the stove, a thin blanket half on him, Safa nearer than she had been in months, so near that when he lifted a hand to scratch his eyebrow, her ear brushed his wrist. The clock said an hour insistently. Outside, the road shrugged back into ordinariness. The blue gate, slightly ajar, framed a slice of rinsed sky. He thought of the first time he had seen Safa pressed into the verge, the way hope had been a splinter then, and felt a circle close without any of the pomp circles usually demand. He did not make a speech to the morning. He stood, warmed milk, added tea leaves, stirred. When the cups were ready, he set one by his sister's door, one by the vet's number on the fridge like a toast to the unseen tether that had held them through the night, and one on the floor near Safa's place, out of reach but within scent, because love has its own ceremonies. Safa opened her eyes. The storm was gone. What remained was the strange, sturdy quiet that sometimes follows rescue. The quiet in which a house learns it can be bigger than it was, and a man learns he can too.